Case 1. The Killer Clown. Marlene Warren, Wellington, Florida, May 26, 1990. It was a Saturday morning in the quiet Wellington suburb of Palm Beach County, Florida. Marlene Warren, 40 years old, was home with her son and some of his friends. Breakfast had been made. The neighborhood was still. The sun was out. At 10:45 in the morning, the front doorbell rang. When Marlene opened the door, the figure standing on her step made no immediate sense. A full clown costume, bright orange wig, white face paint, red nose. In one gloved hand, a bouquet of balloons, one of them reading the words, "You're the greatest." In the other hand, a bunch of flowers. For a fraction of a second, maybe less, it might have read as a surprise. A joke. Something eccentric and harmless that would get explained in the next moment. Then the clown raised a pistol and shot Marlene Warren in the face. The figure turned, walked calmly back to a waiting white Chrysler convertible, and drove away. Marlene's son and his friends rushed to her. She was alive, barely. She would die 2 days later in the hospital without ever regaining consciousness. The image of it, the costume, the balloons, the sunny Saturday morning in a Florida suburb, became one of the most recognizable and surreal crime scenes in American true crime history. The first investigation. Palm Beach County detectives arrived at a scene that was unusual in almost every way. The getaway vehicle, a white Chrysler LeBaron, was found abandoned within days. The balloons were cataloged. The neighborhood was canvassed at length, but the disguise had been total. Witnesses described a figure in full face paint and gloves. No features, no skin, no fingerprints on anything touched during the encounter. From the beginning, 2 names surfaced consistently. Marlene's husband, Michael Warren. The couple's marriage was under strain, and Michael ran a used car lot with a reputation for questionable dealings. And Sheila Keene, a co-worker of Michael's who was widely understood to be considerably more than that. Investigators focused on Sheila with purpose. She matched the general physical description. She was known to have visited a local costume shop. Employees there would later recall a woman purchasing a clown costume, an orange wig, white face paint, and 2 specific balloons in the days before the murder. The chain of circumstantial evidence was compelling. But in 1990, compelling wasn't enough. There were no fingerprints, no DNA match, no murder weapon. The case stalled, and the years began to accumulate. In 2002, Michael Warren and Sheila Keene married each other. Marlene had been dead for 12 years. The cold case unit refuses to stop. Every few years through the 1990s and 2000s, journalists returned to the killer clown story. It had the quality of a mystery that people couldn't quite set down. The image of the costume, the balloons, the inexplicable calm of the figure walking away. A new generation would discover it and feel the same unsettled confusion. But Palm Beach County's cold case unit was doing more than reviewing old clippings. In the 2010s, investigators resubmitted the physical evidence for modern forensic testing. Hair fibers recovered from inside the abandoned Chrysler LeBaron were analyzed using DNA technology that hadn't existed in 1990. The results matched Sheila Keene Warren. That wasn't all. New witnesses had emerged over the years, people who had held back, waiting for the case to be further along before they came forward. They spoke about statements Sheila had made about wanting Marlene removed from the picture, about seeing a woman matching her description near the crime scene. The old evidence and the new testimony rebuilt the case from the foundation. Arrest, plea, and what it meant. In 2017, 27 years after Marlene Warren answered her door for the last time, Sheila Keene Warren was arrested at the Virginia home she shared with Michael. They had been running a fast food restaurant, building a quiet life far from Florida. The arrest made national headlines. The pretrial process stretched for years. Sheila maintained her innocence and pleaded not guilty. Then, in April 2023, facing the evidence and the prospect of a mandatory life sentence, she changed her plea. guilty to second-degree murder. The sentence was 12 years. For Marlene's family, the number felt insufficient, measured against 33 years of waiting. But the admission, the formal acknowledgement of guilt, carried its own weight. The case had finally closed. Not quickly, not cleanly, but closed. Marlene Warren opened her front door on a Saturday morning and found someone who had planned her death carefully enough to buy a costume, practice a disguise, and carry a gun inside a bouquet of flowers. The DNA left in that getaway car waited 27 years to say exactly who that was. If you're new here, welcome. Subscribe to Truth and Evidence Crime Cases and hit that notification bell. We cover true crime, cold cases, and the evidence behind the stories. New cases every single week. You don't want to miss what's coming. Case 2. The Altar. Arlis Perry, Stanford University, California. October 12, 1974. It was just past midnight on a Sunday when Arlis Perry walked away from her husband Bruce across the Stanford University quad. They'd had a small argument. Nothing serious. The ordinary friction of two people adjusting to a new place and a new life together. Arlis was 19. She'd come from Bismarck, North Dakota, recently married, earnest and religious, still finding her footing in the coastal California world of a major research university. She was heading to the campus memorial church. It was a place she found calming. She'd been before. Bruce watched her cross the quad. He didn't follow. He would never see her alive again. When she didn't return, he called campus security. Officers checked the church doors at around 2 in the morning and found nothing concerning. It wasn't until nearly 6 a.m., when a guard arrived to unlock the building for morning prayers, that the crime was discovered. Arlis Perry had been murdered near the altar. Her body had been arranged deliberately, church candles placed on and around her in a way that communicated intent far beyond the act of violence itself. Her clothing had been disturbed. Her head had been turned to face the cross. The staging was precise, symbolic, and deeply, immediately disturbing. The investigation and the weight of speculation. Palo Alto police and Stanford security responded thoroughly. Bruce Perry was questioned, passed a polygraph, and cleared. The church, visited by hundreds of people each week, presented a forensic challenge that was difficult to overcome in 1974. Fingerprints were smudged. DNA science was decades away from practical use. Investigators built a list of persons of interest and worked through it methodically. Known sex offenders in the area were examined. Students and clergy were interviewed. Every lead was followed. None of them led anywhere conclusive. One name remained in the background, not as a formal suspect, just a detail. Stephen Crawford, a campus security guard who worked the late shift. A quiet, unremarkable former police officer who lived near campus. He was also the man who had found Arlis's body that morning. At the time, there was nothing to move on. He was a familiar face. His discovery of the body was noted and filed. As the investigation stalled, the ritualistic nature of the crime scene fed a different kind of narrative. The staging, the candles, the symbolism. All of it fueled rumors that would persist for years. Satanic cults, secret societies on campus, occult involvement, books were written, documentaries were proposed. Theories proliferated. For Arlis's family, each new wave of speculation reopened wounds and distorted the memory of a deeply religious young woman from North Dakota into something she would have found unrecognizable. 44 years. In 2018, Santa Clara County cold case investigators submitted evidence from the original crime scene, including a palm print from a church door and biological material from Arlis's clothing for modern DNA analysis. The results came back pointing directly to Stephen Crawford, the man who had found Arlis Perry's body 44 years earlier, the man who had been a peripheral background figure in the investigation from the beginning. The man who worked the campus at night and knew exactly where to go and exactly how to present himself the following morning. Armed with a search warrant, investigators went to Crawford's apartment in San Jose. As they knocked and announced their presence, Crawford pulled out a handgun and shot himself. He died without making a statement. No confession. No explanation. No accounting for 4 decades of freedom. The answer, and the absence of resolution. The Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office announced that the case was solved. There would be no trial. No courtroom. No answers to the questions that had accumulated since 1974. Only the confirmation. Stephen Crawford had killed Arlis Perry. He had staged the scene deliberately. He had found her the next morning and performed the role of a concerned security officer finding a tragedy. There were no cults. No rituals. No secret societies. There was a predator with a uniform and a position of trust, using the darkness of a building he had access to, and the professional credibility of his job to disappear back into the background. Arlis Perry was 19 years old. She went to a church for peace after a minor argument with her husband. The man who killed her worked the night shift on the same campus, and was among the first people on the scene the following morning. He held that secret for 44 years. A palm print on a door and a lab in 2018 held it longer. Case 3. The Ghost WHO Taunted. April Tinsley, Fort Wayne, Indiana, April 1, 1988. 8-year-old April Tinsley left her home in Fort Wayne, Indiana on Good Friday morning to visit a friend who lived 1 block away. She never arrived. 3 days later, on April 4th, a jogger found her body in a roadside ditch roughly 20 miles outside of town. April had been abducted, sexually assaulted, and suffocated. One of her shoes was missing. A child's plastic raincoat had been discarded nearby, tossed away with the indifference of someone who had already decided what April's life was worth. The crime devastated Fort Wayne. Parents pulled children inside. Neighbors watched one another differently. The community's sense of safety, the particular ease that comes from believing your street is safe for an 8-year-old to walk 1 block, was gone. The first investigation and the limits of 1988. Fort Wayne investigators processed the scene carefully and thoroughly. DNA evidence was collected, notable for 1988, when the forensic application of DNA technology was in its very early stages. Hundreds of interviews were conducted across northeast Indiana. Nothing led to an arrest. Months passed. Then years. April's face appeared on posters and in annual news retrospectives. The trail went cold. And then the killer chose to make himself known. The Taunts, 1990 and 2004. In 1990, 2 years after the murder, a message appeared on the door of a barn a few miles from where April's body had been found. Written in crayon, it read, "I kill 8-year-old April Marie Tinsley." He had left used condoms alongside it. A deliberate, grotesque calling card. The message was processed for evidence. Nothing led to an arrest. 14 years later, in 2004, he came back. 4 young girls in Fort Wayne found notes in their bicycle baskets and on their porches. Each one referenced April by name. Each one contained threats. Polaroid photographs and used condoms were included with some. One note read, "I am the same person that kidnapped, raped, and killed April Tinsley. You are my next victim." He was still in Fort Wayne, still living inside the community he had terrorized, still taunting investigators who had now spent 16 years trying to find him. The FBI developed a criminal profile. Composite sketches were released. Tip lines filled with calls. He disappeared again. Genetic genealogy, 2018. When Indiana State Police decided in 2018 to apply forensic genetic genealogy to April's case, they were working with DNA evidence preserved from 1988 and supplemented by the 2004 materials. The profile was uploaded to public genealogy databases. A genealogy expert traced the genetic matches through family trees until a direction emerged, northeast Indiana. The analysis narrowed to 2 brothers. One of them was John D. Miller. He lived a few miles from April's home. He had lived there the whole time. Investigators mounted covert surveillance and collected discarded items from his property. The DNA matched. The confession. On July 15, 2018, officers approached Miller at his trailer. He offered no resistance. His confession was methodical and deeply disturbing, delivered without visible remorse, focused on the sequence of events rather than their meaning. He confirmed everything: the barn graffiti, the 2004 notes, the photographs. When asked why he had written to those children in 2004, he had no explanation that made any sense of it. In December 2018, John D. Miller pleaded guilty to murder and child molestation. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. April Tinsley was 8 years old, walking 1 block. For 30 years, the man who killed her attended the same community events, lived within miles of her family, and taunted the investigation twice. Genetic genealogy didn't just solve the case. It confirmed that the danger had never actually left. You're watching Truth and Evidence crime cases. These cases represent real families, real people who waited years, sometimes decades, for answers that should have come far sooner. If this content matters to you, subscribe and share it. Help these stories reach the people who need to hear them. Case 4. The Wrong Man. Angie Dodge, Idaho Falls, Idaho, June 13, 1996. On the morning of June 13, 1996, 2 of Angie Dodge's co-workers went to her downtown Idaho Falls apartment when she didn't show up for work. Angie was 18 years old. She had recently moved into her own place for the first time, eager, independent, a year out of high school, and genuinely excited about what came next. She was warm, creative, known for her love of poetry and music, and for the ease she brought to the people around her. Inside her apartment, investigators found a crime scene that made clear her attacker had left behind biological evidence. In 1996, that was significant. DNA forensics were already being used to solve crimes. The evidence collected from Angie's apartment should have made the path to justice straightforward. Instead, it became the center of one of the most disturbing wrongful conviction cases in Idaho history. Interrogation and a confession that should not have happened. Idaho Falls investigators focused quickly on Angie's social circle. A young man named Benjamin Hobbs, who had a prior sex crime arrest in Nevada, was examined. His acquaintance, 20-year-old Christopher Tapp, came into the picture when questioned about his movements the night before the murder. Tapp had no criminal record, no history of violence, and his DNA did not match the biological evidence collected from the scene. What happened during the subsequent interrogations has since been extensively documented and studied as a case study in coercive interview practices. Tapp was subjected to multiple sessions without adequate legal protection. He was confused, pressured, and fed details he could not have known independently. Over time, under the accumulated weight of the process, he began to confess, multiple times, in accounts that sometimes aligned with the evidence and sometimes directly contradicted it. In 1998, Christopher Tapp was convicted of rape and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The DNA from the crime scene excluded him entirely. This fact was documented, available, set aside. Carol Dodge in the fight for the truth. Tapp maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration. In the years that followed, Angie's mother, Carol Dodge, watched the interrogation tapes carefully. What she saw troubled her deeply. She began advocating publicly for Tapp's exoneration, a position that required enormous personal courage from a woman who had lost her daughter to a violent crime. The Idaho Innocence Project launched a formal campaign. The DNA evidence was retested repeatedly. Every result was identical. The biological material belonged to an unknown man with no connection to any named suspect. By 2017, the weight of the evidence and the advocacy surrounding the case became impossible to ignore. Tapp's conviction was vacated. After 20 years in prison, he walked free. Though technically still labeled an accomplice on paper, a compromise that satisfied no one fully. Angie's real killer had been free the entire time. Brian Drips, across the street. Forensic genetic genealogy provided the answer that 2 decades of investigation had not. The DNA profile from the crime scene was uploaded to a public database. Genealogists built a family tree from the genetic matches. Branch by branch, the tree narrowed to one name: Brian Drips. In 1996, Drips had lived directly across the street from Angie Dodge's apartment building. He had been interviewed in the original investigation and categorized as an unremarkable peripheral witness. In 2019, investigators placed him under covert surveillance and collected a cigarette butt he discarded on the street. The DNA was an exact match. Confronted with the evidence, Drips confessed. He described what he had done in detail and confirmed explicitly that Christopher Tapp had no involvement whatsoever. Tapp was officially and fully exonerated. Drips pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Angie Dodge's murder is one story. Christopher Tapp's 20 years in prison for a crime he did not commit is another. Both happened because someone chose the appearance of a solved case over the discipline of evidence. Angie's killer lived across the street and watched the wrong man go to prison. A cigarette butt eventually said what 20 years of interrogation tape could not. Case 5. The Radio Intern. Helen Prusinski, Inglewood, Colorado, January 16, 1980. January in Colorado carries a cold that gets inside your coat before you've made it half a block. Helen Prusinski was 21 years old and far from home. A student from Massachusetts, she had come to the Denver area for a radio journalism internship. Excited, focused, starting the chapter of her life she'd worked toward. She was staying with her aunt and uncle and commuting to the radio station by bus. On the evening of January 16, 1980, she stepped off her bus and began the short walk to their house. She never arrived. The following afternoon, a rancher passing nearby found her body in a frozen field on the outskirts of the city. She had been bound, sexually assaulted, and stabbed multiple times. The brutality and deliberateness of what had been done to her left investigators shaken. This was not a crime of accident or escalation. This was someone who had followed Helen Prusinski from a public bus stop, taken her into a field, and killed her with deliberate force. The investigation: no witnesses, no leads. Investigators worked the scene completely. Footprints and tire tracks were documented. Fibers were collected. Biological evidence left by Helen's attacker was carefully preserved. In 1980, forensic DNA analysis as a practical investigative tool did not yet exist, but the team preserved what they had with the knowledge that science might eventually catch up. No one had seen the abduction. No one remembered a suspicious vehicle near the bus stop. The gap between Helen stepping off the bus and reaching her aunt's front door was perhaps 8 minutes, and the killer had used every second of it. Helen's family, her mother, her sister, her friends in Massachusetts, kept calling, kept writing, kept following up with investigators across the years. In the early 2000s, the biological evidence was submitted to national DNA databases. No match was returned. Forensic Genealogy, 2019. In 2019, investigators uploaded Helen's case DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database. The analysis returned a distant relative, a fourth or fifth cousin, as a match. Genealogists built outward from that connection, narrowing through family tree branches until a single name emerged: James Curtis Clanton, a man now living in Florida, thousands of miles from the Colorado field where Helen's body had been found 40 years earlier. Investigators established surveillance. They collected a used beer mug Clanton left behind at a local bar. The DNA was a definitive match to the 1980 crime scene. Confession and sentencing. When detectives went to Clanton's home and presented what they had, he confessed. He described seeing Helen near the bus stop that evening. Following her, acting on what he described as an impulse he couldn't explain or account for. In July 2020, 40 years after Helen Prusinski's murder, James Curtis Clanton pleaded guilty in a Colorado courtroom. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was in his late 70s. Helen Prusinski had been in Colorado for weeks. She was building something, a career, an adult life, a future in radio journalism. The walk between the bus stop and her aunt's front door should have taken 10 minutes. James Curtis Clanton made sure it took 40 years longer to mean anything. The DNA from that frozen field had more patience than he did. Case 6. The Orange Socks. Bobby Joe Oberholtzer and Annette Schnee, Colorado Rockies. January 6, 1982. The Colorado Rocky Mountains in January offer a particular kind of isolation. The roads through the high passes are narrow and icy. The towns are tight-knit. And in 1982, hitchhiking was a practical and widely accepted way to get around for people who worked in the ski economy surrounding resort towns like Breckenridge. On the night of January 6th, two women were separately trying to make their way home. Bobby Joe Oberholtzer was 29 years old, adventurous, outgoing, a wife and mother who worked as a receptionist. She finished her shift, stopped briefly at a local bar, and put her thumb out for a ride. Annette Schnee was 21, warm, hard-working, a medical assistant who dreamed of becoming a flight attendant. She too was trying to get back to Blue River after a long day. The two women didn't know each other. They would become permanently linked by what happened to them that night. Two discoveries. Bobby Joe's husband went looking for her when she didn't come home. Before dawn, a passing motorist found her body in a snowbank along Hoosier Pass. She had been shot in the chest at close range. Her backpack was nearby, and beside her body, an orange sock, one that had not belonged to her. Annette's fate was unclear for months. She simply didn't appear. Her family held on to hope through the winter. In July, 6 months after she had disappeared, a young boy fishing in a creek found her body downstream. Annette had also been shot. On her foot, an orange sock, matching the one found beside Bobby Joe. The cases were linked immediately. The orange socks became the most haunting physical detail of a case that would remain open for nearly 4 decades. A strange, specific signature that investigators returned to again and again. The man on the mountain. On the same night the two women disappeared, something seemingly unrelated happened on Guanella Pass. High on the pass at nearly 11,000 feet, a plane spotted a pickup truck stranded in deep snow. Rescuers found a man inside, half frozen, claiming he'd gotten stuck driving home from a bar. His name was Alan Lee Phillips, a local mechanic, a familiar face in the mountain community. He was treated as a survivor, a minor good news story in a winter full of bad roads. No one asked him much. He went home. 40 years of dead ends. The murders of Bobby Joe Oberholtzer and Annette Schnee became among the most discussed cold cases in Colorado history. Investigators worked through hundreds of leads across decades. The bullet casings were studied. The orange socks were analyzed. Items belonging to the victims, including Annette's backpack and ID, found miles apart, suggested a killer who had traveled significant distances that night and left evidence across a wide area. Nothing led to an arrest. Generation after generation of investigators reviewed the file and hit the same walls. 2020, the family tree leads home. In 2020, forensic genealogists were brought in to analyze DNA evidence recovered from items at the crime scenes, including material from the orange socks that had sat in evidence storage for nearly 40 years. The analysis built a family tree from genetic database matches. Branch by branch, generation by generation, it narrowed. It led to Alan Lee Phillips, the man rescued from the snowbound pass on the night of the murders. The man whose location that night placed him in exactly the areas where both women had last been seen. Investigators covertly collected his DNA from a discarded item. The match to the crime scene evidence was unambiguous. Trial and conviction. In February 2021, 39 years after that frozen January night, Alan Lee Phillips was arrested and charged with both murders. At trial, he maintained his innocence throughout. The jury was not persuaded. In September 2022, Phillips was convicted of the murders of Bobby Joe Oberholtzer and Annette Schnee. He was sentenced to life in prison. 2 women trying to get home on a cold night. A killer who staged his own rescue in a snowstorm and walked back into the community without consequence. An orange sock that outlasted everyone's patience, survived 40 years of storage, and eventually said exactly what it had always known. Case 7. The Campus Restroom. Sophie, Sergie, University of Alaska, Fairbanks. April 25, 1993. April in Fairbanks, Alaska does not look the way April looks anywhere else. The UAF campus was still under late-season snow. The nights were long. The buildings emptied early. Sophie Sergie was 20 years old. She wasn't enrolled at UAF. She was visiting friends and had come to Fairbanks for a dental appointment. She was from Pitkas Point, a remote Yupik village on the Yukon River, and she carried with her a set of ambitions that felt enormous against the landscape she'd grown up in. Marine biology. A career. A bigger life. She was staying in Bartlett Hall, a co-ed dormitory at the center of campus. On the night of April 25th, she had spent hours studying with a friend. Around 1 in the morning, she said she was going downstairs to smoke a cigarette and use the restroom. She never came back upstairs. The next afternoon, a janitor made the discovery. Sophie's body was found in a second-floor women's restroom, inside a locked stall. She had been sexually assaulted and shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber pistol. There were no signs of a struggle. Whatever had happened quickly and quietly, in a building in the middle of a campus that was supposed to be safe, and the killer had walked out and left no visible trace. Investigation and the silence of 1993 technology. Alaska State Troopers and campus police moved immediately. Every person in the building that night was interviewed. Evidence was collected systematically: a spent casing, cigarette butts, and biological material from the attacker. In 1993, that biological material could not be developed into a workable DNA profile. The technology existed in theory, but not in the form needed to identify an unknown individual from limited trace evidence. The case went cold quickly. Sophie's mother wrote letters to the governor. Her friends kept her memory present through public appeals. The university implemented new security measures. But the answers didn't come. Over the following decades, investigators ran DNA comparisons whenever new suspects emerged, or when technology advanced enough to try again. More than 100 men were tested. None of them matched. Parabon Nanolabs, a family in Maine. In 2018, Alaska investigators submitted the crime scene's unknown DNA profile to Parabon Nanolabs, a company that had become a leading resource in forensic genetic genealogy. The analysis worked through public genealogy databases, building a family tree from distant genetic matches. The branches of the tree led not to Alaska, but to Maine, almost 4,000 miles away. Within the identified family, investigators found a name: Stephen Downs. In 1993, Downs had been a freshman at UAF. He had lived in Bartlett Hall, the same building, the same year, the same dormitory where Sophie Sergie was found. After UAF, he had returned to Maine and built a life there. He was working as a nurse. Investigators established surveillance and collected a discarded coffee cup. The DNA matched the crime scene profile conclusively. Arrest, trial, conviction. In February 2019, Stephen Downs was arrested at his Maine home and extradited to Alaska to face charges of murder and sexual assault. At trial, his defense argued that the DNA evidence was the result of contamination or coincidence. The jury found neither argument credible. The DNA on Sophie's clothing and on the cigarette butts in the Bartlett Hall restroom belonged to Stephen Downs. In February 2022, Downs was convicted of murder and sexual assault. He was sentenced to 75 years in prison. Sophie Sergie came to Fairbanks for a dental appointment. She was 20 years old, visiting friends. staying in a dormitory, going downstairs in her pajamas to use a restroom at 1 in the morning. Stephen Downs lived down the hall. He knew the building. He walked out and went home to Maine and became a nurse and lived with it for 26 years. A coffee cup ended that. Case 8. The River Rock. Krystal Beslanowitch, Provo River, Utah, December 15, 1995. The snow was falling hard on the night of December 15, 1995, when sheriff's deputies received the call. Krystal Beslanowitch was 17 years old. She had drifted through a difficult adolescence, leaving home in Montana, moving through shelters, landing in Salt Lake City in the kind of circumstances that left her exposed to dangers that don't discriminate and don't warn you before they arrive. Her body was found near the banks of the Provo River, half buried in the snow and reeds. She had been beaten with a river rock, a stone that weighed over 20 pounds, with a sustained force and deliberateness that told investigators everything about the kind of person who had done it. Krystal's face was unrecognizable. Her clothing was missing. She had been left in the cold without any regard for what she had been, for who would miss her, or for what her life had meant to the people who had known her. The evidence and the limits of 1995. Detectives worked the scene thoroughly. The rock was recovered and logged into evidence. Tire tracks and stray hairs were documented. A cigarette butt was collected. Investigators worked through Salt Lake City, following every available lead. In 1995, the concept of touch DNA, the ability to extract a usable genetic profile from skin cells deposited when a person grips an object, was not a practical forensic reality. The biological evidence collected was insufficient for the technology of the era. The rock was bagged, labeled, and stored. The case went cold. Krystal's mother never stopped pursuing it. She attended press conferences. She called investigators. She brought her daughter's case to anyone who would take the time to listen. Year after year, with no result. Detective Jensen and the Rock. In 2013, the Utah County Sheriff's Office established a dedicated cold case unit. Detective Jensen, known for pursuing the apparently impossible, pulled Krystal's file. He believed the rock still held something. He sent it to a forensic laboratory in Florida that specialized in low-level DNA extraction. The lab applied a technique called mini-STR analysis, carefully swabbing the rough surface of the rock and amplifying whatever genetic material remained from 18 years of storage. A usable profile was generated. It was entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database, and returned a match, Joseph Michael Simpson, a former cab driver with a history of violent offenses who had been in Utah at the time of Krystal's murder. He had been looked at in the original investigation and released. He had since moved to Florida. Conviction. Investigators flew to Florida and established surveillance. They collected a discarded cigarette. The DNA confirmed the CODIS result without ambiguity. When confronted, Simpson denied everything. At trial in 2016, more than 20 years after Krystal's murder, the evidence was presented clearly and completely. Joseph Michael Simpson was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Krystal's mother spoke at the sentencing. Her voice carried 2 decades of waiting. She was just a child, she said. She mattered. She was loved. Krystal Beslanowitch was 17. She was vulnerable in the ways that happen when systems fail people and when danger finds the gaps. Her killer apparently believed that made her invisible. A single grip on a river rock said otherwise. Case 9. 3 words. Roxanne Wood, Niles, Michigan, February 20th, 1987. Doug and Roxanne Wood had been bowling together that Tuesday evening. An ordinary night, the kind couples have without thinking much about it. Roxanne went home early. She had work in the morning. Doug stayed to finish out the game. When he walked through the front door just after midnight, the house was quiet in a way that was wrong. He found Roxanne in the kitchen. She was 30 years old. She had been killed, her throat cut, blood pooling on the linoleum floor. She was already gone. Doug's 911 call, launched one of the longest-running cold case investigations in Michigan history. The shadow over Doug. From the moment police arrived, the narrative of suspicion took shape around Doug Wood. The story was too convenient, investigators said. A husband goes out. A wife stays home. He comes back and finds her dead. For years, decades, Doug lived under that suspicion. He passed polygraph after polygraph. There was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime. But there was also no one else, and in the absence of another explanation, the community's informal verdict settled over him. He kept his story. Roxanne's family mourned. The case was periodically reviewed and periodically shelved. Somewhere, a killer lived freely in Michigan. Forensic genealogy closes in. In the late 2010s, investigators returned to the biological evidence collected from the Wood kitchen in 1987. Using forensic genetic genealogy, they built a family tree from the genetic matches available in public databases. By 2021, the analysis had produced a name, Patrick Wayne Gillum, a Michigan man with a criminal record, but no connection that investigators could identify to either Doug or Roxanne Wood. He was not someone who had come up in the original investigation. Investigators covertly collected his DNA from a discarded item. The lab returned a direct match to the 1987 crime scene. I did it. When detectives went to Patrick Gillum in 2022 and presented the evidence, there was a brief, heavy silence. Then he said 3 words. I did it. Gillum pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to a minimum of 23 years in prison. For Doug Wood, those 3 words ended 35 years of living under a cloud. His innocence was no longer a matter of argument or implication. It was a matter of record. For Roxanne's family, the moment was bittersweet in the particular way that only decades-delayed justice can be. The grief had long since changed shape. What the confession gave them was not relief so much as formal confirmation of what they had always believed. Roxanne Wood was 30 years old, married, working at a plant in Michigan, bowling on a Tuesday evening. She went home a little early. That single unremarkable decision is the only thing that connected her to Patrick Gillum. The DNA he left in her kitchen waited 35 years to say his name. Case 10. The Purple Dress. Linda O'Keefe, Newport Beach, California, July 6, 1973. It was the first morning of summer break. Linda O'Keefe was 11 years old. She had spent the morning at summer school and was walking home through the quiet, eucalyptus-lined streets of Newport Beach. She was wearing a purple dress, sewn by hand by her mother. That afternoon, when she didn't come home, her family's worry became something else entirely. The next morning, a cyclist found Linda's body in a ditch along Back Bay Drive, miles from where she had last been seen. She had been strangled. One witness had seen her speaking with a man in a turquoise van. His face was not clear. His name was not known. Newport Beach, a community built around the idea that it was safe, had never experienced anything like it. Linda's murder removed a kind of innocence from a neighborhood that doesn't grow back. The investigation, and 45 years. Detectives worked the case carefully and preserved biological evidence from the scene. The turquoise van was described in composite sketches. Witnesses were interviewed. The evidence sat in storage. In 1973, there was no DNA analysis, no forensic genealogy, no national databases to run a profile against. The years accumulated. Linda's face appeared in anniversary news stories. Her family kept asking. Investigators kept the file live, tweeting a murder 45 years later. In 2018, the Newport Beach Police Department made an unconventional investigative decision. They began live tweeting Linda's last day. Hour by hour, they narrated her walk home from summer school, her route, her surroundings, the moment she was seen talking to a stranger, in her imagined voice, unfolding on social media in real time as if it were happening now. The response was immediate and national. Linda's story trended. Tips arrived from people who had been alive in Newport Beach in the summer of 1973, and it carried something they'd never thought to report. Running parallel to the social media strategy was a forensic genealogy investigation already underway. The DNA profile preserved from 1973 was matched against public genealogy databases. Genealogists built a family tree that led to a man now living quietly in Florida, James Allen Neal. In the early 1970s, he had lived in Southern California, blending into the background without ever raising any particular alarm. Investigators collected a discarded coffee cup. The DNA match was indisputable. An arrest without a trial. In February 2019, 45 years after Linda walked home in her purple dress for the last time, James Allen Neal was arrested and charged with her abduction, sexual assault, and murder. He was in his 70s. The arrest was national news, but the trial Linda's family had waited nearly half a century for never happened. In July 2020, James Allen Neal died in custody. He left no confession, no final accounting, no explanation for Linda's family. The certainty of his guilt was established by science and confirmed by his arrest. The courtroom reckoning Linda's mother had waited 47 years to witness never came. Linda O'Keefe was 11 years old, wearing a dress her mother had made for her, walking home on the first day of summer break. James Allen Neal drove a turquoise van through a neighborhood that trusted itself. He lived 46 years with what he did. A coffee cup in Florida said otherwise. The trial didn't happen. The answer did. 10 cases. 10 families. Some of them waited 30 years. Some waited 40. One family waited more than 46. What ties these cases together isn't geography, or the profile of the killer, or the method of the crime. What ties them together is something simpler and harder to sit with. Somewhere in the physical evidence of each murder, a piece of the person who committed it remained. Microscopic, invisible, outlasting every assumption that time had erased it. Forensic science didn't just solve these cases. It changed what cold cases mean. It changed what unsolvable means. It established that a killer who disappears into Florida in 1973 can be identified from a coffee cup in 2019. That a man who staged his own rescue from a snowstorm in 1982 can be convicted in 2022. That a campus security guard who found the body he had positioned near an altar in 1974 can be named by a palm print 44 years later. There is no perfect crime in the age of forensic genealogy. There is only time, and time runs out. The names that should be carried forward from this episode are not the names of the killers: Marlene Warren, Arlis Perry, April Tinsley, Angie Dodge, and Christopher Tapp, who lost 20 years of his life to a conviction that should never have happened. Helen Prusinski, Bobby Joe Oberholtzer, Annette Schnee, Sophie Sergie, Krystal Beslanowitch, Roxanne Wood, Linda O'Keefe. These are the names that outlast the headlines. I'm your host. This has been Truth and Evidence Crime Cases. If this episode stayed with you, share it. Subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment below. Which of these cases hit you the hardest? We'll see you on the next one. Thank you for watching Truth and Evidence Crime Cases. If you believe these stories deserve to be heard, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video. Every view keeps these cases in front of new eyes. Justice delayed is not justice denied, but it has to be pursued. We'll keep pursuing it. See you next time.